Welcome to the Humanities and Patient-Centered Healthcare. Language and communication are central to maximizing the patient's best interests and effective healthcare delivery. Language context, approach, and form greatly influence how the patient and healthcare providers structure, interpret, and assess communications in what is fundamentally a patient-centered interprofessional process. This presentation focuses on unearthing some of the epistemological and metaphysical structures of language, such as: what is language? How does language communicate? What are the nature and limits of knowledge in language? Is the use of language in order to investigate language fundamentally circular and problematic? What is the language of language? In order to investigate these questions, this 5-part series will cover the following topics: language as a representation of cognitive ideas, solipsism and knowledge, language as thought, language as pluralistic frameworks and the incommunicable, and language and the synapses of the brain. Language and communication are central to maximizing the patient's best interests and effective healthcare delivery. The first perspective that will be covered is that language represents ideas. A cognitive being has an idea in their mind, and language is a tool used to represent and communicate that idea to another perceiver. The perceiver perceives the language, which represents the author's idea. Then the perceiver translates that language back into the author's original cognitive idea. Problems with the duplication of ideas arise if the author's language is unable to perfectly represent the author's idea. The perceiver's understanding of the author's language is not perfectly in sync with the author's intention, and the translation of the perceived language in order to duplicate the author's original idea is not perfectly performed. Then there are questions as to just what exactly is an idea. Do ideas have quantitative, qualitative, and other types of characteristics? Is language limited in what it is able to characteristically represent? Is this very discussion being limited by the ability of language to represent ideas, as well as the limits of the perceiver's ability to translate the language back into the idea? From this perspective, language as representation of cognitive ideas becomes a type of sensation. The causes of sensation are referred to as sense data, and sense data itself has little if any resemblance at all to that which it represents. For example, let's suppose that we have a light source. Some of the light waves from this source are absorbed, and some of the light waves from this source are reflected off of an object. The light waves that are reflected off of the object then are perceived by a perceiver through the stimulation of rods and cones in the eyes that stimulates the synapses in the brain, creating the experience of green. Question: is the object green? Or does the object have the characteristics of reflecting a particular wavelength of light that the perceiver then experiences as the color green? In other words, if the experience of color is a purely subjective experience, then it follows that color does not exist independently of the experiencing observer. Certainly there is external sense data, such as the wavelengths of light that stimulates the sense organ resulting in the experience of color, but color in and of itself would be an experience, not a physical reality. The representative problem is the inaccurate propensity to think of the object reflecting the light as inherently green, i.e., naive realism. Naive realism may be useful for getting around in the world, but it is problematic and an error if the goal is to determine what can be known and what the nature of reality might be. If language is representative of ideas, like sense data represents external reality, then the subjective experience of the idea, like the subjective experience of external reality, would have little to no resemblance to language, and external reality would have little to no resemblance to the subjective experience. If all knowledge claims are subjective experiences that have little to no resemblance to the causation of those experiences, then what can be known about language or sense data? Logically, it follows that an experiencer can know nothing but their own experiences. In other words, since experiences have little to no resemblance to their causes, then experiencing beings end up being in a solipsistic state. Solipsism is the position that all knowledge is, at best, only the subjective experiences of the experiencer, which may have little to no resemblance to outside reality. Since experiencers can only experience subjective experiences, and since experiencers cannot directly experience another's subjective experiences, it follows that all experiencers are epistemically alone, even if they are socially organized. From this representative perspective of language, you are alone in the universe. Descartes recognized this issue when he performed his methodical doubt, in which he doubted anything and everything that could be doubted. Descartes threw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, until he ended up doubting his very own existence. But in his doubting of his own existence, he recognized that that very activity actually affirmed his existence, at least as a thinking substance. I think, therefore I am. However, this solipsistic, alone in the universe state is really not that difficult to escape. After all, an experiencer cannot experience another experiencer's experiences. Languages are communal, and most perceptions are determined. Since you cannot know what it's like to be a bat, cat, or fish, bats, cats, and fish must be independent of your own thoughts. Since you cannot know how and what others communicate, and since we must socially learn the vocabulary and structure of language in order to communicate, language is not private. Since you can't control your perceptions of sense data, such as perceiving green grass as pink grass, your perceptions are determined by causations that are external to yourself. Clearly, you are not alone in the universe. Healthcare professionals are participating in a social activity that requires them to verify each other's communicative content for the maximization of the patient's best interests. This verification can be referred to as a reflective equilibrium process. Reflective refers to the process of referencing back and forth what each communicator is understanding the other to be communicating. Equilibrium refers to the process of coming to an agreed upon understanding or consensus. Healthcare delivery uses this reflective equilibrium process in order to establish intersubjective consensus. In addition to the perspective that language represents ideas, another perspective is that language is the very thought, and thought is the very language. In other words, language and thought are inseparable and one and the same. Without language, there would be no thoughts, and without thoughts, there would be no language. Perhaps a good example of language as thought is this very discussion we are having. If language is thought, would it even be possible for us to think about this discussion of language without the use of language? From this perspective of language as thought, thoughts are formed within the framework of language. And when the language is communicated to a perceiver, the perceiving mind directly acquires the language and thus the direct thought. There is no intermediary transformation of thought to language and then language to thought, as the language is identical to the thought. As a result, the structure, form, and sophistication of the language would be directly related to the structure, form, and sophistication of the thoughts. Simple languages would tend towards simple thoughts, and more complex languages would tend towards more complex thoughts. Conversely, simple thoughts would tend towards the having of simple languages, and more complex thoughts would tend towards the having of more complex languages. Interestingly, if language is thought, then nothing could be known outside of the linguistic construct, as the linguistic construct would be all there is to know. In other words, reality would be entirely incomprehensible or meaningless outside of the linguistic construct, even if there were to be reality independent of language. Any thought would be by definition language, and any language would also be the thought. If thoughts occur only through the use of language, then it would follow that any being that has no language would also have no thoughts. This perspective may be particularly problematic if moral considerability were to be associated with being a thinking being, as no being would be thinking unless they had language. Another dimension to language as being thought position is a question of whether or not it is possible to have a private language that is not recognized by anyone else, or whether or not all language must by definition be communal. If a private language is possible, then there could be private thoughts. If all language is communal, then it would follow that all thoughts would be communal. The empirical fact that social beings learn specific languages from others is evidence that language acquisition is a communal activity. If language is a communal activity, and if language is thought, then it follows that thoughts are communal. Just as genes pass on physical traits from one generation to another, it follows from this perspective of language being thought that it is the communal language that passes on the thought structures from one generation to another. Language, and therefore thought structures, are communal activities. Healthcare professionals work within this communal interactive society, and interprofessionalism recognizes and accentuates the importance of this communicative activity. This process necessitates the activity of social reflective equilibrium, or the back and forth communicative process that verifies accurate and proper understanding of the language constructs that are individual, social, and technologically laden. Since language is a communal activity, it follows that healthcare is also a communal activity as recognized by the interprofessional healthcare process. Another perspective is that language has pluralistic frameworks, and that the nature and function of language varies considerably according to what is being communicated. The language of mathematics is particularly useful in the analysis of particular aspects of sense data and measurements of space and time. However, mathematics doesn't seem to be very useful in the communication of historical or emotional events. Body language, on the other hand, seems to be particularly effective in communicating emotional events and of physical feelings of pain and pleasure, but not very useful in the mathematical analysis of sense data or the communication of purposes and/or ends. Verbal and written language is particularly useful in the communication of historical events, purposes, and ends, and is also sometimes inextricably part of or identical to some cognitive thoughts. The cognitive experiences of the mind are wide and varied. Some of those experiences are conducive to particular language frameworks, others not so. Language problems occur when one type of language framework is used to communicate an incompatible thought. The game of charades is a fun example. Healthcare professionals need to pay particular attention to both what is communicated and what is not communicated, all while recognizing the nature and limits of a wide variety of pluralistic frameworks of language. The communicative process is so complex and variable that it's hard to imagine how healthcare delivery could be successful outside of this interactive process. Language is a cornerstone to effective healthcare delivery. Then there are the types of thoughts that are not conducive to any type of language framework and are characterized as being incommunicable. The experiences of sense data such as sight, taste, sound, touch, smell, and emotions seem to be in this category. The color green, for example, is a purely subjective experience of the mind that is not a specific word or substance. There are no green words or green atoms, as words and atoms are colorless. Perhaps in this case, language is simply being used to point towards those instances that result in such subjective experiences. If the experience of color is purely subjective, does that mean that such experiences are therefore relative? An example of a false thought experiment that all of us have probably committed at one time or another would be that from the same sense data stimulation, one person could be subjectively experiencing red while another person could be subjectively experiencing blue. After all, how would we be able to falsify a subjective experience? How would we ever know? Ophthalmologists, using the Ishihara plates, or colorblind testing charts, have been able to empirically test whether or not people experience colors more similarly than dissimilarly. They found that people overwhelmingly experience colors more similarly than dissimilarly. In other words, it has been empirically proven to be false that people's subjective experiences of colors are radically different from each other. Empirical evidence can falsify or affirm subjective experiences. In fact, empirical evidence points towards intersubjective agreements, meaning that just because an experience is subjective, it doesn't follow that such experiences are necessarily relative. As such, using language to point towards other examples of conditions that result in agreed upon and measured intersubjective experiences can be an effective way to communicate. If asked, "What do you mean?" one option would be to point towards a sense data that results in the agreed upon intersubjective experience. Perhaps art and its ability to elicit certain types of emotions could be such a language pointing activity. Healthcare professionals are constantly dealing with not only the data readouts of technological facts and treatment plans, even more importantly, healthcare professionals must deal with all the incommunicable aspects of patient healthcare treatment. These incommunicable components are what make healthcare an interpretive art rather than a robotic technical skill. The human condition, our shared agreed upon intersubjective experiences, seems to be an integral and necessary component for the maximization of healthcare outcomes and patient best interests. Since the humanities are particularly effective in this holistic communicative process, perhaps the humanities should have a much larger role to play in healthcare prognosis, delivery, and care. The language of language is wide and varied. Language can be oral, written, physical, mathematical, artistic, and more. Language can represent or even be particular ideas, thoughts, concepts, and emotions. Language is composed of or represents a variety of intersubjective communal experiences. However, our discussion has focused primarily on the conceptual relationships of language and not on the physical and chemical dependent relationship of the brain's synapses. Without the brain's synapses, there would be no thoughts or experiences. And without thoughts and experiences, there would be no community, no language, and no knowledge. Without physical matter, epistemology and metaphysics would be unthinkable. Historically, people incorrectly believed in a mind-body dualism, in which mind was immaterial and the body was material. What is mind? Never matter. What is matter? Never mind. In contrast, our contemporary society has established, through the use of the scientific method, that matter can exist without mind, and so far it appears that the mind cannot exist without matter. In the end, language and all that is knowable is fundamentally based on the structures and activities of the nervous system, or more specifically, the small gap between neurons that permits electrical or chemical signals to pass to another neuron, the synapse. Healthcare professionals may find it advantageous to make the expedient but false dualistic divisions of mind and body. However, since reality is in fact holistic, it is important for all parties involved in the diagnosis and treatment process to understand that this holism promotes the social interactive maxim of patient best interests through patient-centered healthcare delivery. Language is holistic in nature, with attributes that are both physical and non-physical. As social beings, we transcend the nature and limits of the various language frameworks using a reflective equilibrium process. Humanities, with its rich and varied history and contributions to the communicative process, makes it the cornerstone of science, politics, and patient-centered interprofessional healthcare. Humanities is patient-centered healthcare because the humanities provides the methods and means for an examined life. As Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living.